running a whole different theology about the morality of nuclear weapons than the one that we ascribe to. Anyway, in 1953 thereabouts, Jack might correct me on some of these facts, they started building a plant in Colorado at Rocky Flats. By then, the U.S. had signed on to the Teller idea that we needed to have the hydrogen bomb, that the atomic bomb was fine for blowing up those two cities, but now they had tested it and blown up a couple of big islands in the Pacific. And the decision was made that you needed a lot of triggers for the bigger bomb. And so plutonium was the choice of the device to build them, and at that time there were probably only a few hundred bombs. By the end of this cycle there were maybe 25,000. And so a plant like Rocky Flats had a lot to do. And it really existed off the radar for a very long time. I guess the society in those days was more comfortable with, we don't need to know. I mean, there's still a version of that around. But then it was just rampant. So there was little, if any, publicity in the press about what they did at Rocky Flats. And we found in the 70s that there was still a huge denial policy about what they actually did there. But they built this sort of core. Some people say it's the size of a football or so. It goes into the hydrogen bomb, sets off the chain reaction that eventually breaks apart atoms and then fuses two back together, and boom, you get all this energy. So it existed. There was a couple of important events, and they had a terrible fire there in 1957, which did not get much publicity, but was way worse than the one that did get publicity in 1969. And by 69 and into the early 70s, Rocky Flats was kind of on the map in Colorado and increasingly around the country. So they started doing off-site testing, and so much of the opposition, at least that got a lot of people involved the fact that this is kind of a pollution mess, as well as making all these bombs that are designed to turn cities into vapor somewhere else. But off-site testing of soils and a medical person from Jefferson County started doing some studies. Did this increase cancer in the area? If so, how much? But by the mid-70s, kind of after the Vietnam War was over, which affected a lot of the energy and focus of anti-war people, they started looking at this plant as something that needed to be addressed as a moral issue, as a political issue, as a health issue. And always, this is my judgment, it was easier to get more people involved if they thought there was going to be more cancer. And so that broadened the spectrum of people that got involved. And, but the nuclear weapons piece was always in there, largely because a lot of us kept pushing that, the scale of human destruction and devastation that would come from ever using these bombs so dwarfed the fact that they also produced some pretty bad pollution, and sometimes it blew off the place. But they finally, in that period, there started to be big demonstrations at Rocky Flats in the late 70s. Sometimes as many as 300 people arrested on a single day, and a lot of long-term resistance actions. I think I was arrested there about 10 times over the course of trying to make the point of opposition. And somebody you might have heard of, Jennifer Haynes, has even written a book about her repeated attempts to pray at Rocky Flats, and how each of those cases unfolded and so on. So the relationship, I guess, to back up just a little bit here, the initial plutonium explosives devices got built at Los Alamos. They made the ones that went off at Hiroshima. They would have built the ones that before '53 that got used in the bombs of the day. But it became a huge growth industry once the U.S. went H-bomb. And so you needed a lot of these pits, and then the arms race just kept escalating, from a few hundred up to 25,000 or more. So it grew. The plant, I guess, roughly, by the time we started looking at it, had maybe around 4,000 employees. But partly because of the push about pollution and that sort of thing, they actually had to hire more people because they had to start cleaning up their messes. They were making it more because people had made an issue of it. And then in the late 80s, of course, the end of the Cold War was in the wings, and some, basically the nuclear arsenal got cut in half. The U.S. and the Russians about the same. So you ended up with a huge stockpile. So you really didn't need a full-bore factory to keep making these. And then there was, some hope that maybe this reduction would go all the way down to zero and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, the plant, a lot of us would like to claim that we closed Rocky Flats because of our opposition. And I think, I think we certainly raised consciousness, and we certainly led to that focus on safety that they didn't have before. But the actual closure of the plant just kind of came out of a surplus of these pits, of these football-sized, whatever they were. Now, where does Los Alamos come into this picture? First of all, it's there because it preceded Rocky Flats in the production of the core element of the nuclear bomb. But now they're looking around. The people that really like nuclear weapons, for lack of a better word, they don't want to see them just on the shelf. One thing they claim they worry about is they might get stale, and if you try to blow up a city, they may not go off. So maybe even the pits we have, maybe we need to resurface them. But especially, this thing to get a new pit factory is they want to perhaps have smaller nuclear weapons that are more easily conceived to be used in a smaller context. Kind of getting rid of this firewall between conventional and nuclear war. So that if they wanted to do that, they might actually have to come up with some new designs. So, Rocky Flats is gone. They can't make them there. So they've been scouting around since then to a facility that might fill that bill. Make new, downsized, if you will, nuclear weapon cores and their other components. And this thing about making bombs smaller, I just finished reading a book about the person that's called the father of the Minuteman missile, Bernard Schriever. We have an Air Force base named after him in Colorado. And it's quite a fascinating book, very well written. But I found out that, the bomb that blew up Bikini Island and that sort of thing was way, way, way bigger than they could ever get on a missile to go someplace. So part of their struggle in the 50s was to get the missiles a little bigger and get the bombs a little smaller, still plenty big. I mean, still, vaporize a whole city. But so the technology on missile development and bomb development was going on at the same time until they came out with the winner. Came out with the Minuteman missile, which is still the land-based choice of nuclear weapon, and has a warhead to match how far it can throw something.